A Voyage to Laputa. Chapter 1. I had not been at home above 10 days when Captain William Robinson, a Cornish man, commander of the Hopewell, a stout ship of 300 tons, came to my house. I had formerly been surgeon of another ship where he was master, and a fourth part owner, in a voyage to Levant. He had always treated me more like a brother than an inferior officer, and hearing of my arrival made me a visit, as I apprehended only out of friendship, for nothing passed more than what is usual after long absences. But repeating his visits often, expressing his joy to find me in good health, asking whether I now settled for life, adding that he intended a voyage to the East Indies in 2 months. At last he plainly invited me, though with some apologies, to be surgeon of the ship, that I should have another surgeon under me besides our 2 mates, that my salary should be double to the usual pay, and that having experienced my knowledge in sea affairs to be at least equal to his, he would enter into any engagement to follow my advice, as much as if I had share in the command. He said so many other obliging things, and I knew him to be so an honest man, that I could not reject his proposal. The thirst I had of seeing the world, notwithstanding my past misfortunes, continuing as violent as ever. The only difficulty that remained was to persuade my wife, whose consent, however, I at last obtained by the prospect of advantage she proposed to her children. We set out the 5th of August, 1706, and arrived at Fort St. George the 11th of April, 1707. We stayed there 3 weeks to refresh our crew, many of whom were sick. From thence we went to Tonquin, where the captain resolved to continue some time, because many of the goods he intended to buy were not ready, nor could he expect to be dispatched in some months. Therefore, in hopes to defray some of the charges he must be at, he bought a sloop, loaded it with several sorts of goods, wherewith the Tunaquis usually trade to the neighboring islands. And putting 14 men on board, whereof 3 were of the country, he appointed me master of the sloop, and gave me power to traffic for 2 months, while he transacted his affairs at Tonquin. We had not sailed above 3 days when a great storm arising, we were driven 5 days to the north-northeast, and then to the east, after which we had fair weather, but still with a pretty strong gale from the west. Upon the 10th day we were chased by 2 pirates, who soon overtook us, for my sloop was so deep loaden that she sailed very slow, neither were we in a condition to defend ourselves. We were boarded about the same time by both the pirates, who entered furiously at the head of their men, but finding us all prostrate upon our faces, for so I gave our order, they pinioned us with strong ropes, and set a guard upon us, went to search the sloop. I observed among them a Dutchman, who seemed to be of some authority, though he was not commander of either ship. He knew us by our countenances to be Englishmen, and jabbering us to be in his own language, swore we would be tied back to back, and thrown into the sea. I spoke Dutch tolerably well. I told him who we were, and begged him, in consideration of our being Christians and Protestants of neighboring countries in strict alliance, that he would move the captains to take some pity on us. This inflamed his rage. He repeated his threatenings, and turning to his companions, spoke with great vehemence in the Japanese language, as I suppose, often using the word Cristianos. The largest of the 2 pirate ships was commanded by a Japanese captain, who spoke a little Dutch, but very imperfectly. He came up to me, and after several questions, which I answered in great humility, he said we should not die. I made the captain a very low bow, then turning to the Dutchman, said I was sorry to find more mercy in a heathen than in a brother Christian. But I had soon reason to repent those foolish words, for that malicious reprobate, having often endeavored in vain to persuade both the captains that I might be thrown into the sea, at which they would not yield to after the promise made me, that I should not die, however prevailed so far as to have a punishment inflicted upon me, worse in all human appearance than death itself. My men were set by an equal division into both of the pirate ships, and my sloop now manned. As to myself, it was determined that I should be set adrift in a small canoe with paddles and a sail, and 4 days' provisions, which last the Japanese captain was so kind to double out of his own stores, and would permit no man to search me. I got down into the canoe, while the Dutchman, standing upon the deck, loaded me with all the curses and injurious terms his language could afford, About an hour before we saw the pirates, I had taken an observation and found we were in the latitude of 46 north and the longitude of 183. When I was some distance from the pirates, I discovered by my pocket glass several islands to the southeast. I set up my sail, the wind being fair, with a design to reach the nearest of those islands, which I made a shift to do in about 3 hours. It was all rocky, however, I got many birds' eggs, and striking fire, I kindled some heath and dry seaweed, by which I roasted my eggs. I ate no other supper, being resolved to spare my provisions as long as I could. I passed the night under the shelter of a rock, throwing some heath under me, and slept pretty well. The next day I sailed to another island, and thence to a third and fourth, sometimes using my sail and sometimes my paddles. But not to trouble the reader with a particular account of my distresses, let it suffice that on the 5th day I arrived at the last island in my sight, which lay south-southeast to the former. This island was at greater distance than I expected, and I did not reach it in less than 5 hours. I encompassed it almost round before I could find a convenient place to land in, which was a small creek about 3 times the wideness of my canoe. I found the island to be all rocky, only a little intermingled with tufts of grass and sweet-smelling herbs. I took out my small provisions, and after having refreshed myself, I secured the remainder in a cave, whereof there were great numbers. I gathered plenty of eggs upon the rocks, and got a quantity of dry seaweed and parched grass, which I designed to kindle the next day, and roast my eggs as well as I could. For I had about me my flint, steel, match, and burning glass. I lay all night in the cave, where I had lodged my provisions. My bed was the same dry grass and seaweed which I intended for fuel. I slept very little, for the disquiets of my mind prevailed over my weariness, and kept me awake. I considered how impossible it was to preserve my life in so desolate a place, and how miserable my end must be. Yet I found myself so listless and desponding that I had not the heart to rise, and before I could get spirits enough to creep out of my cave, the day was far advanced. I walked a while among the rocks. The sky was perfectly clear, and the sun so hot that I was forced to turn my face from it, when all on a sudden it became obscured, as I thought, in a manner very different from what happens by the interposition of a cloud. I turned back and perceived a vast opaque body between me and the sun, moving forwards towards the island. It seemed to be about 2 miles high, and hid the sun 6 or 7 minutes. But I did not observe the air to be much colder, or the sky more darkened, than if I had stood under the shade of a mountain. As it approached nearer over the place where I was, it appeared to be a firm substance, the bottom flat, smooth, and shining, very bright from the reflection of the sea below. I stood upon a height about 200 yards from the shore, and saw this vast body descending almost to a parallel with me, at less than an English mile distance. I took out my pocket perspective, and could plainly discover numbers of people moving up and down the sides of it, which appeared to be sloping, but what those people were doing, I was not able to distinguish. The natural love of life gave me some inward motions of joy, and I was ready to entertain a hope that this adventure might some way or other help me deliver me from the desolate place and condition I was in. But at the same time, the reader can hardly conceive my astonishment to behold an island in the air, inhabited by men, who were able, as it should seem, to raise or sink, or put it into a progressive motion as they pleased. But not being at that time in a disposition to philosophize upon the phenomenon, I rather chose to observe what course the island would take, because it seemed for a while to stand still. Yet soon after advanced nearer, and I could see the sides of it, encompassed with several graduations of galleries, and stairs at certain intervals to descend from one of the other. In the lowest gallery, I beheld some people fishing with long angling rods, and others looking on. I waved my cap, for my hat was long since worn out, and my handkerchief towards the island, and upon its nearer approach I called out and shouted with my utmost strength of my voice, and then looking circumspectively, I beheld a crowd together at that side which was most in my view. I found by their pointing towards me, to each other, that they plainly discovered me, although they made no return to my shouting. But I could see 4 or 5 men running in great haste up the stairs to the top of the island, who then disappeared. I happened rightly to conjecture that these were sent for orders to some person in authority upon this occasion. The number of people increased, and in less than half an hour the island was moved and raised in such a manner that the lowest gallery appeared in a parallel of less than 100 yards distance from the height where I stood. I then put myself into the most supplicating postures and spoke in the humblest accent, but received no answer. Those who stood nearest over against me seemed to be persons of distinction, as I suppose by their habit. They conferred earnestly with each other, looking often upon me. At length one of them called out in a clear, polite, smooth dialect, not unlike in sound to an Italian, and therefore I returned it in an answer in that language, hoping at least that the cadence might be more agreeable to his ears. Although neither of us understood the other, yet my meaning was easily known, for the people saw the distress I was in. They made signs for me to come down from the rock and to go towards the shore, which I accordingly did, and the flying island being raised to a convenient height, the verge directly over me, a chain was let down from the lowest gallery, with a seat fastened to the bottom, to which I fixed myself and was drawn up by pulleys. Chapter 2. At my alighting, I was surrounded by a crowd of people, but those who stood nearest seemed to be of better quality. They beheld me with all the marks and circumstances of wonder. Neither, indeed, was I much in their debt, having never till then seen a race of mortals so singular in their shapes, habits, and countenances. Their heads were all reclined either to the right or the left, one of their eyes turned inwards, and the other directly up to the zenith. Their outward garments were adorned with the figures of suns, moons, and stars, interwoven with those of fiddles, flutes, harps, trumpets, guitars, harpsichords, and many other instruments of music unknown to us in Europe. I observed here and there many in the habit of their servants, when a blown bladder fastened like a flail to the end of a short stick, which they carried in their hands. In each bladder was a small quantity of dried pest, or little pebbles, as I afterwards was informed. With these bladders they now and then flapped the mouths and ears of those who stood near them, of which practice I could not then conceive the meaning. It seems the minds of these people are so taken up with the intense speculations that they can neither speak nor attend to the discourses of others without being roused by some external tactician upon the organs of speech and hearing. For which reason these persons who are able to afford it always keep a flapper, the original is climinol, in their family, as one of their domestics, nor ever walk abroad to make visits without him. And the business of this officer is, when the two or more persons are in company, gently to strike with his bladder the mouth of him who is to speak, and the right ear of him or them to whom the speaker addresseth himself. This flapper is likewise employed diligently to attend his master in his walks, and upon occasion to give him a soft flap on his eyes, because he is always so wrapped up in cognition that he is in manifest danger of falling down every precipice, and bouncing his head against every post, and in the streets of justling others, or being justled himself into the kennel. It was necessary to give the reader this information, without which he would be at some loss, with me, to understand the proceedings of these people, as they conducted me up the stairs, to the top of the island, and from thence to the royal palace. While we were ascending, they forgot several times what they were about, and left me to myself, till their memories were again roused by their flappers, for they appeared altogether unmoved by the sight of my foreign habit and countenance, and by the shouts of their vulgar, whose thoughts and minds were much more disengaged. At last we entered the palace and proceeded into the chamber of presence, where I saw the king seated upon his throne, attended on each side by persons of prime quality. Before the throne was a large table filled with globes and spheres, and mathematical instruments of all kinds. His Majesty took not the least notice of us, although our entrance was not without sufficient noise, by the concourse of all persons belonging to the court. But he was then deep in a problem, and we attended at least an hour before he could solve it. There stood by him on each side a young page, with flaps in their hands, and when they saw he was at leisure, one of them gently struck his mouth, and the other his right ear, at which he started, like one awakened on the sudden, and looking towards me, and the company I was in, recollected the occasion of our coming, whereof he had been informed before. He spoke some words, whereupon immediately a young man with a flap came up to my side, and flapped me gently on the right ear. But I made signs, as well as I could, that I had no occasion for such an instrument, which, as I afterwards found, gave his Majesty and the whole court a very mean opinion of my understanding. The king, as far as I could conjecture, asked me several questions, and I addressed myself to him in all languages I had. When it was found that I could neither understand nor be understood, I was conducted by his king's order to an apartment in his palace, this prince being distinguished above all his predecessors for his hospitality to strangers, where 2 servants were appointed to attend me. My dinner was brought, and 4 persons of quality, whom I remembered to have seen very near the king's person, did me the honor to dine with me. We had 2 courses of 3 dishes each. In the first course there was a shoulder of mutton cut into an equilateral triangle, a piece of beef into a rhombus, and a pudding into a solenoid. The second course was 2 ducks, trussed up into the form of fiddles, sausages and puddings resembling flutes and hautboys, and a breast of veal in the shape of a harp. The servants cut our bread into cones, cylinders, parallelograms, and several other mathematical figures. While we were at dinner, I made bold to ask the names of several things in their language, and these noble persons, by the assistance of their flappers, delighted to give me answers, hoping to raise my admiration of their great abilities. If I could be brought to converse with them, I was soon able to call for bread and drink, or whatever else I wanted. After dinner, my company withdrew, and a person who sent to me by the king's order, attended by a flapper. He brought with him a pen, ink, and paper, and 3 or 4 books, giving me to understand by signs that he was sent to teach me the language. We sat together 4 hours, in which time I wrote down a great number of words in columns, with the translations over against them. I likewise made a shift to learn several short sentences, for my tutor would order one of my servants to fetch something, to turn about, to make a bow, to sit, or to stand, or walk, and the like. Then I took down the sentence in writing. He showed me also in one of his books the figures of the sun, moon, the stars, the zodiac, the tropics, the polar circles, together with the denominations of many figures of planes and solids. He gave me the names and descriptions of all the musical instruments and the general terms of art in playing on each of them. After he had left me, I placed all my words with their interpretations in alphabetical order, and thus, in a few days, by the help of some very faithful memory, I got some insight into their language. The word which I interpret the flying or floating island is the original Laputa, whereof I could never learn the true etymology. Lap, in the old obsolete language, signifies high, and untu, a governor, from which they say corruption, was derived Laputa, from the Lapunta. But I do not approve of this derivation, which seems to be a little strained. I ventured to offer to the learning among them a conjecture of my own, that Laputa was quasi-lap-outed, the lap signifying properly the dancing of the sunbeams in the sea, and outed a wing, which however I shall not obtrude, but submit to the judicious reader. Those to whom the king had entrusted me, observing how ill I was clad, ordered a tailor to come next morning and take my measure for a suit of clothes. This operator did his office after a different manner from those of his trade in Europe. He first took my altitude by a quadrant, and then with a rule and compasses described the dimensions and outlines of my whole body, all which he entered upon paper, and in 6 days brought my clothes very ill made and quite out of shape by happening to mistake a figure in the calculation. By my comfort was that I observed such accidents very frequent and little regarded. During my confinement, for want of clothes, and by an indisposition that held me some days longer, I much enlarged my dictionary, and when I went next to court was able to understand many things the king spoke, and to return him in some kind answers. His Majesty had given orders that the island should move northeast and by east, to the vertical point over Lagado, the metropolis of the whole kingdom, below the firm earth. It was about 90 leagues distant, and our voyage lasted 4 days and a half. I was not in the least sensible of the progressive motion made by the air of the island. On the second morning, about 11 o'clock, the king himself in person, attended by nobility, courtiers, and officers, having prepared all their musical instruments, played on them for 3 hours without intermission, so that I was quite stunned with the noise, neither could I possibly guess the meaning, till my tutor informed me. He said that the people of their island had their ears adapted to hear the music of the spheres, which always played at certain periods, and the court was now prepared to bear their part in whatever instrument they most excelled. In our journey towards Lagado, the capital city, His Majesty ordered that the island should stop over certain towns and villages, from whence he might receive the petitions of his subjects, and to this purpose several pack-threads were let down with small weights to the bottom. On these pack-threads the people strung their petitions, which mounted up directly like scraps of paper fastened by schoolboys at the end of the string that holds their kite. Sometimes we received wine and victuals from below, which were drawn up by pulleys. The knowledge I had in mathematics gave me quite assistance in acquiring their phraseology, which depended so much upon that science and music, and in the latter I was not unskilled. Their ideas are perpetually conversant in lines and figures. If they would, for example, praise the beauty of a woman or any other animal, they describe it by rhombs, circles, and parallelograms, ellipses, and other geometrical terms, or by words of art drawn from music, needless here to repeat. I observed in the king's kitchen all sorts of mathematical and musical instruments, after the figures of which they cut up the joints that were served to his majesty's table. Their houses were very ill built, the walls bevel, without one right angle in any apartment, and this defect arises from the contempt they bear to practical geometry, which they despise as vulgar and mechanic. Those instruments they give being too refined for the intellectuals of their workmen, which occasions perpetual mistakes, and although they are dexterous enough upon a piece of paper in the management of the rule, the pencil, and the divider, yet in the common actions and behavior of life I have not seen a more clumsy, awkward, and unhandy people, nor so slow and perplexed in their own conceptions upon all other subjects, except those of mathematics and music. They are very bad reasoners and vehemently given to opposition, unless when they happen to be of the right opinion, which is seldom their case. Imagination, fancy, and invention are wholly strangers to, nor have any words in their language, by which these ideas can be expressed, the whole compass of their thoughts and mind being shut up within the two forementioned sciences. Most of them, and especially those who deal in the astronomical part, have great faith in judicial astrology, although they are ashamed to own it publicly. But what I chiefly admired, and thought altogether unaccountable, was the strong disposition I observed in them towards news and politics, perpetually inquiring to public affairs, giving their judgments in matters of state, and passionately disputing every inch of a party opinion. I have indeed observed the same disposition amongst most of the mathematicians. I have known in Europe, although I could never discover the least analogy between the two sciences, unless these people suppose that because the smallest circle hath as many degrees as the largest, therefore the regulation and management of the world require no more abilities than the handling and turning of a globe. But I rather take this quality to spring from a very common infirmary of human nature, inclining us to be more curious and concited in matters which we have least concern, and for which we are least adapted either by study or nature. These people are under continual disquietudes, neither enjoying a minute's peace of mind, and their disturbances proceed from causes which very little affect the rest of mortals. Their apprehensions arise from several changes they dread in the celestial bodies. For instance, that the earth, by the continual approaches of the sun towards it, must in course of time be absorbed or swallowed up, that the face of the sun will by degrees be encrusted with its own effluvia, and give no more light to the world, that the earth very narrowly escaped a brush from the trail of the last comet, which would have infallibly reduced it to ashes, and that the next, which they have calculated for 31 years hence, will probably destroy us. For if in its perihelion it should approach within a certain degree of the sun, as by their calculations they have reason to dread, it will conceive a degree of heat 10,000 times more intense than that of a red-hot glowing iron, and in its absence from the sun carry a blazing trail 10,114 miles long, the which if the earth should pass at the distance of 100,000 miles from the nucleus or main body of the comet, it must in its passage be set on fire and reduced to ashes. That the sun, daily spending its rays without any nourishment to supply them, will at last be wholly consumed and annihilated, which must be attended with the destruction of this earth, and of all the planets that receive their light from it. They are so perpetually alarmed by the apprehensions of these and the like impending dangers, that they can neither sleep quietly in their beds, nor have any relish for the common pleasures or amusements of life. When they meet an acquaintance in the morning, the first question is about the sun's health, how he looked at his setting and rising, and what hopes they have to avoid the stroke of the approaching comet. This conversation they are apt to run into with the same temper that boys discover in delighting to hear terrible stories of sprites and hobgoblins, which they greedily listen to and dare not go to bed for fear. The women of the island have abundance of vivacity. They contemn their husbands and are exceedingly fond of strangers, whereof there is always a considerable number from the continent below, attending at court, either upon affairs of several towns and corporations, or their own particular occasions, but are much displeased, because they want the same endowments. Among these the ladies choose their gallants, but the vexation is that they act with too much ease and security, for the husband is always so wrapped in speculation that the mistress and lover may proceed to the greatest familiarities before his face, if he but provided with paper and implements, and without his flapper at his side. The wives and daughters lament their confinement to the island, although I think it the most delicious spot of ground in the world. And although they live here in the greatest plenty and magnificence, they are allowed to do whatever they please. They long to see the world and take the diversions of the metropolis, which they are not allowed to do without a particular license from the king. And this is not easy to be obtained, because the people of quality have found by frequent experience how hard it is to persuade their women to return from below. I was told that a great court lady who had several children is married to the prime minister, the richest subject in the kingdom, a very graceful person, extremely fond of her, and lives in the finest place of the island. Went down to Lagado, on the pretense of health. There hid herself for several months, till the king sent a warrant to search for her, and she was found in an obscure eating-house, all in rags, having pawned her clothes to maintain an old deformed footman, who beat her every day, and in whose company she was taken much against her will. And altogether her husband received her with all possible kindness, and without the least reproach. She soon after contrived to steal down again with all her jewels to the same gallant, and hath not been heard of since. This may perhaps pass with the reader rather for a European or English story, rather for one of a country so remote, but he may please to consider that the caprices of womankind are not limited by any climate or nation, and that they are much more uniform than can be easily imagined. In about a month's time I had made a tolerable proficiency in their language, and was able to answer most of the king's questions. When I had the honor to attend him, His Majesty discovered not the least curiosity to inquire into the laws of government, history, religion, or manners of the countries where I had been, but confined his questions to the state of mathematics, and received the amount I gave him with great contempt and indifference, although often roused by his flapper on either side. Chapter 3. I desired leave of this prince to see the curiosities of the island, which he was graciously pleased to grant, and ordered my tutor to attend me. I chiefly wanted to know to what cause in art or nature it owed its several motions, whereof I will now give a philosophical account to the reader. The flying or floating island is exactly circular, its diameter 7,837 yards, or about 4 miles and a half, and consequently contains 10,000 acres. It is 300 yards thick. The bottom or under surface, which appears to those who view it from below, is one even regular plate of adamant, shooting up to the height of about 200 yards. Above it lie the several minerals in their usual order, and over all is a coat of rich mold, 10 or 12 feet deep. The declivity of the upper surface, from the circumference to the center, is the natural cause why all the dews and rains which fall upon the island are conveyed in small rivulets towards the middle, where they are emptied into 4 large basins, each about half a mile in circuit, and 200 yards distant from the center. From these basins the water is continually exhaled. The water is continuously exhaled by the sun in the daytime, which effectively prevents their overflowing. Besides, as it is in the power of the monarch to raise the island above the region of clouds and vapors, he can prevent from the falling of dews and rains whenever he pleases. For the highest clouds cannot rise above 2 miles, as naturalists agree, at least they are never known to do so in that country. At the center of the island there is a chasm about 50 yards in diameter, from whence the astronomers descend into a large dome, which is therefore called Blandona Gagnor, or the astronomer's cave, situated at the depth of 100 yards beneath the upper surface of the adamant. In this cave are 20 lamps continually burning, from which the reflection of the adamant casts a strong light into every part. The place is stored with a great variety of sextants, quadrants, telescopes, astrolabes, and other astronomical instruments. But the greatest curiosity upon which the fate of the island depends is a lodestone of prodigious size, in shape resembling a weaver's shuttle, and is in length 6 yards and in the thickest part of 3 yards over. This magnet is sustained by a very strong axle of adamant passing through its middle, upon which it plays, and is poised so exactly that the weakest hand can turn it. It is hooped round with a hollow cylinder of adamant, 4 feet deep, as many thick, and 12 yards in diameter, placed horizontally, and supported by 8 adamantine feet, each 6 yards high. In the middle of the concave side there is a groove 12 inches deep, in which the extremities of the axle are lodged, and turned round as there is occasion. The stone cannot be moved from its place by any force, because the hoop and its feet are one continued piece, with the body of adamant which constitutes the bottom of the island. By means of this lodestone, the island is made to rise and fall, and move from one place to another, for with respect to that part of the earth over which the monarch presides, the stone is endued at one of its sides with an attractive power, and at the other with a repulsive. Upon placing the magnet erect, with its attracting end towards the earth, the island descends, but when the repelling extremity points downwards, the island mounts directly upwards. When the position of the stone is oblique, the motion of the island is too so. For in this magnet the forces always act in lines parallel to its direction. By this oblique motion the island is conveyed to different parts of the monarch's domains. To explain the manner of its progress, let A, B represent a line drawn across the dominions of Balnibarbi. Let the line c, d represent the lodestone, of which let d be repelling end, and c the attracting end. The island being over C, let the stone be placed in the position c, d, with the repelling end downwards. Then the island will be driven upwards obliquely towards D. When it is arrived at D, let the stone be turned upon its axle till its attracting end points towards E, and the island will be carried obliquely towards E, where if the stone be again turned upon its axle till stands in position E, F, with its repelling point downwards, the island will rise obliquely towards F, where by directing the attracting end towards G, the island may be carried to G to form G to H. By turning this stone so as to make its repelling extremely point directly downwards, and thus by changing the situation of the stone as often as there is occasion, the island is made to rise and fall by turns in an oblique direction, and by those alternate risings and fallings, the obliquity being not considerable, is conveyed from one part of the dominions to the other. What? But it must be observed that this island cannot move beyond the extent of the dominions below, nor can it rise above the height 4 miles, from which the astronomers, who have written large systems concerning the stone, assign the following reason: that the magnetic virtue does not extend beyond the distance of 4 miles, and that the mineral which acts upon the stone in the bowels of the earth, and in the sea about 6 leagues distance from the shore, is not diffused through the whole globe, but terminated with the limits of the king's dominions. And it was easy from the great advantage of such a superior situation for a prince to bring under his obedience whatever country lay within the attraction of that magnet. When the stone is put parallel to the plane of the horizon, the island standeth still, for in that case the extremities of it being at equal distance from the earth act with equal force, the one in drawing downwards, the other in pushing upwards, and consequently no motion can ensue. This lodestone is under the care of certain astronomers, who from time to time give it such positions as the monarch directs. They spend the greatest part of their lives in observing the celestial bodies, which they do by the assistance of glasses, far exceeding ours in goodness. For although their largest telescopes do not exceed 3 feet, they magnify much more of those of 100 yards among us, and at the same time show the stars with greater clearness. This advantage hath enabled them to extend their discoveries much further than our astronomers in Europe. They have made a catalogue of 10,000 fixed stars, whereas the largest of ours do not contain above 1/3 part of that number. They have likewise discovered 2 lesser stars, or satellites, which revolve about Mars, whereof the innermost is distant from the center of the primary planet exactly 3 of the diameters, and the outermost 5. The former resolves in the space of 10 hours, and the latter in 21.5, so that the squares of their periodical times are very near in the same proportion with the cubes of their distance from the center of Mars, which evidently shows them to be governed by the same law of gravitation that influences the other heavenly bodies. They have observed 93 different comets and settled their periods with great exactness. If this to be true, and they affirm it with a great confidence, it is much to be wished that their observations were made public, whereby the theory of comets, at which present is very lame and defective, might be brought to the same perfection with other parts of astronomy. The king would be most absolute prince in the universe if he could but prevail on a ministry to join with him, but these having their estates below on the continent, and considering that the office of a favorite hath a very uncertain tenure, would never consent to the enslaving of their country. If any town should engage in rebellion or mutiny, fall into violent factions, or refuse to pay the usual tribute, the king hath 2 methods of reducing them to obedience. The first and mildest course is by keeping the island hovering over such a town, and the lands about it, whereby he can deprive them of the benefit of the sun and the rain, and consequently afflict the inhabitants with dearth and diseases, and if the crime deserve it, they are at the same time pelted from above with great stones against which they have no defense, but by creeping into cellars or caves, where the roofs of their houses are beaten to pieces. But if they still continue obstinate or offer to raise their insurrections, he proceeds to the last remedy by letting the island drop directly upon their heads, which makes the universal destruction both of houses and men. However, this is an extremity to which the prince is seldom driven. Neither indeed is he willing to put it in execution, nor dare his ministers advise him to action, which as it would render them odious to the people, so it would be a great damage to their own estates, which lie all below, for the island is the king's domain. But there is still indeed a more weighty reason why the kings of this country have been always averse from executing so terrible an action, unless upon the utmost necessity. For if the town intended to be destroyed should have in it any tall rocks, as it generally falls out in the larger cities, a situation probably chosen at first with a view to prevent such a catastrophe, or if it abound in high spires or pillars of stone, a sudden fall might endanger the bottom or undersurface of the island, which, although it consists, as I have said, of one entire adamant of 200 yards thick, might happen to crack by too great a shock, or burst by approaching too near to the fires from the houses below, as the backs both of iron and stone will often do in our chimneys. Of all these the people are well apprised, and understand how far to carry the obscenity, with their liberty or property, where their liberty or property is concerned. And the king, when he is highest provoked, and most determined to press his city to rubbish, orders the island to descend with great gentleness, out of a pretence of tenderness to his people, but indeed for fear of breaking the adamantine bottom, in which case it is the opinion of all the philosophers that the Lord's stone could no longer hold it up, and the whole mass would fall to the ground. About 3 years before my arrival among them, while the king was in his progress over his domain, there happened an extraordinary accident, which had like to put a period to the fate of that monarchy, at least as it is now instituted. Lindalino, the second city in the kingdom, was the first his majesty visited in his progress. 3 days after his departure, the inhabitants, who had often complained of great oppressions, shut the town gates, seized on the governor, and with incredible speed and labor erected 4 large towers, one at every corner of the city, which is an exact square, equal in height to a strong pointed rock that stands directly in the center of the city. Upon the top of each tower, as well as upon the rock, they fixed a great lodestone, and in every case their design should fail, they had provided a vast quantity of the most combustible fuel, hoping to burst therewith the adamantine bottom of the island, if the lodestone project should miscarry. It was 8 months before the king had perfect notice that the Lindalinians were in rebellion. He then commanded that the island should be wafted over the city. The people were unanimous, and had laid in store of provisions, and a great river runs through the middle of the town. The king hovered over them several days to deprive them of sun and rain. He ordered many pack-threads to be let down, yet not a person offered to send up a petition, but instead thereof very bold demands, the redress of all their grievances, great immunities, the choice of their own governor, and other like the choice of their own governor and other the like exorbitances, upon which his majesty commanded all the inhabitants of the island to cast great stones from the lower gallery onto the town. But the citizens have provided against this mischief by conveying their persons and effects into the 4 towers, and other strong buildings, and vaults underground. The king being now determined to reduce this proud people, ordered that the island should descend generally within 40 yards of the top of the towers and rock. This was accordingly done, but the officers employed in the work found the descent much speedier than usual, and by turning the lodestone could not without great difficulty keep it in a firm position, but found the island inclining to fall. They sent the king immediate intelligence of this astonishing event, and begged his majesty's permission to raise the island higher. The king consented, a general council was called, and the officers of the lodestone ordered to attend. One of the oldest and expertest among them obtained leave to try an experiment. He took a strong line of 100 yards, and the island being raised over the town above the attracting power they had felt, he fastened a piece of adamant to the end of his line, which had in a mixture of iron mineral, of the same nature with what whereof the bottom or lower surface of the island is composed, and from the lower gallery let it down slowly towards the top of the towers. The adamant was not descended 4 yards before the officer felt it drawn so strongly downwards that he could hardly pull it back up. He then threw down several small pieces of adamant, and observed that they were all violently attracted by the top of the tower. The same experiment was made on the other 3 towers, and on the rock with the same effect. This incident broke entirely to the king's measures, and, to dwell no longer on other circumstances, he was forced to give the town their own conditions. I was assured by a great minister that if the island had descended so near the town as not to be able to raise itself, the citizens were determined to fix it forever, to kill the king and all his servants, and entirely change the government. By a fundamental law of this realm, neither the king nor either of his 2 elder sons are permitted to leave the island, nor the queen, till she is past childbearing. Chapter 4. Although I cannot say that I was ill-treated in this island, yet I must confess I thought myself too much neglected, not without some degree of contempt, for neither prince nor people appeared to be curious in any part of knowledge, except mathematics and music, wherein I was far their inferior, and upon that account very little regarded. On the other side, after having seen all the curiosities of the island, I was very desirous to leave it, being heartily weary of these people. They were indeed excellent in 2 sciences for which I have great esteem, and wherein I am not unversed, but at the same time so abstracted and involved in speculation that I never met with such disagreeable companions. I conversed only with women, tradesmen, flappers, and court pages during the 2 months of my abode there, by which at last I rendered myself extremely contemptible, yet those were the only people from whom I could ever receive a reasonable answer. I had obtained by a hard study a good degree of knowledge in their language. I was weary of being confined to an island where I received so little countenance, and resolved to leave it with the first opportunity. There was a great lord at court, nearly related to the king, for that reason alone used with respect. He was universally reckoned the most ignorant and stupid person among them. He had performed many eminent services for the crown, and great natural and acquired parts, adorned with integrity and honor, but so ill an ear for music that his detractors reported he had been often known to beat time in the wrong place. Neither could his tutors, without extreme difficulty, teach him to demonstrate the most easy proposition in the mathematics. He was pleased to show me many marks of favor, often did me the honor of a visit, desired to be informed in the affairs of Europe, the laws and customs, the manners and learning of the several countries where I had traveled. He listened to me with great attention, and made very wise observations on all I spoke. He had 2 flappers attending him for state, but never made use of them except at court, and in visits of ceremony, and would always command them to withdraw when we were alone together. I entreated this illustrious person to intercede in my behalf with his majesty for leave to depart, which he accordingly did, as he was pleased to tell me, with regret, for indeed he had made several offers very advantageous, which, however, I refused with expressions of the highest acknowledgment. On the 16th day of February, I took leave of his Majesty and the court. The king made me a present to the value of about £200 English, and my protector, his kinsman, as much more, together with the letter of recommendation to a friend of his in Legado, the metropolis. The island being then hovering over a mountain about 2 miles from it, I was let down from the lowest gallery in the same manner as I had been taken up. The continent, as far as it is subject to the monarch of the flying island, passes under the general name of Balnibarbi, and the metropolis, as I have said before, is called Legado. I felt some little satisfaction in finding myself on firm ground. I walked to the city without any concern, being clad like one of the natives, and sufficiently instructed to converse with them. I soon found out the person's house to whom I was recommended, presented my letter from his friend, the grandee in the island, and was received with much kindness. This great lord, whose name was Munodi, ordered me an apartment in his own house, where I continued during my stay, and was entertained in a most hospitable manner. The next morning, after my arrival, he took me in his chariot to see the town, which is about half the bigness of London, but the houses were strangely built, and most of them out of repair. The people in the streets walked fast, looked wild, their eyes fixed, and were generally in rags. We passed through one of the town gates, and went about 3 miles into the country, where I saw many laborers working with several sorts of tools into the ground, but was not able to conjecture what they were about. Neither did I observe any exception either of corn or grass, although the soil appeared to be excellent. I could not forbear admiring at these odd appearances both in town and country, and I made bold to desire my conductor that he would be pleased to explain to me what could be meant by so many busy heads, hands, and faces, both in the streets and in the fields, because I did not discover any good effects they produced. But on the contrary, I never knew a soil so unhappily cultivated, houses so ill contrived, and so ruinous, or a people whose countenances and habit expressed so many misery and want. This Lord Munodi was a person of the first rank, and had been some years governor of Legado, but by a cabal of ministers was discharged for insufficiency. However, the king treated him with a tenderness, as well as a well-meaning man, but of a low contemptible understanding. When I gave the free censure of the country and its inhabitants, he made no further answer than telling me I had not been long enough among them to form a judgment, and that the different nations of the world had different customs, with other common topics to the same purpose. But when we returned to his palace, he asked me how I liked the building, what absurdities I observed, and what quarrel I had with the dress or looks of his domestics. This he might safely do, because everything about him was magnificent, regular, and polite. I answered that his Excellency's prudence, quality, and fortune had exempted him from those defects which folly and bigotry had produced in others. He said if I would go with him to his country house about 20 miles distant, where his estate lay, there would be more leisure of this kind of conversation. I told his Excellency that I was entirely at his disposal, and accordingly we set out the next morning. During our journey, he made me observe the several methods used by farmers in managing their lands, which to me were wholly unaccountable. For except in some very few places, I could not discover one ear of corn or blade of grass. But in 3 hours' traveling, the scene was wholly altered. We came unto the most beautiful country, farmers' houses at small distances, neatly built, the fields enclosed, containing vineyards, corn grounds, and meadows. Neither do I remember to have seen a more delightful prospect. His Excellency observed my countenance to clear up. He told me with a sigh that there his estate began, and would continue the same till we should come to his house. That his countrymen ridiculed and despised him for managing his affairs no better, and for setting so ill an example to the kingdom, which, however, was followed by very few, such as were old and wilful and weak like himself. We came at length to his home, which was indeed a noble structure, built according to the best rules of ancient architecture. The fountains, gardens, walks, avenues, and groves were all disposed with exact judgment and taste. I gave due praises to everything I saw, whereof his Excellency took not the least notice till after supper, when, there being no third companion, he told me with a very melancholy air that he doubted he must throw down his house in town and country, to rebuild them after the present mode, destroy all his plantations and cast others into such a form as modern usage required, and give the same directions to all his tenants, unless he would submit to incur the censure of pride, singularity, affection, ignorance, caprice, and perhaps increase his majesty's displeasure. That the admiration I appeared to be under would cease or diminish when he had informed me of some particulars, which probably I had never heard of at court, the people there being too much taken up in their own speculations to have regarded to what passed down here below. The sum of his discourse was to this effect, that about 40 years ago certain persons went up to Laputa, either upon business or diversion, and after 5 months' continuance came back with a very little smattering in mathematics, but full of volatile spirits acquired in that airy region. That these persons, upon their return, began to dislike the management of everything below, and fell into schemes of putting all the arts, sciences, languages, and mechanics upon a new foot. To this end, they procured a royal patent for erecting an academy of projectors in Legado, and the humor prevailed so strongly among the people that there is not a town of any consequence in the kingdom without such an academy. In these colleges, the professors contrived new rules and methods of agriculture and building, and new instruments and tools for all trades and manufacturers, whereby, as they undertake, one man shall do the work of 10. A palace may be built in a week of materials so durable as to last forever without repairing. All the fruits of the earth shall come to maturity at whatever season we think fit to choose, and increase 100-fold more than they do at present, with innumerable other happy proposals. The only inconvenience is that none of these projects are yet brought into perfection, and in the meantime the whole country lies miserably waste, and the houses in ruin, and the people without food or clothes, by which, instead of being discouraged, they are 50 times more violently bent upon prosecuting their schemes, driven equally on by hope and despair. That is, for himself, being not of an enterprising spirit, he was content to go on in the old forms, to live in the houses his ancestors had built, and act as they did in every part of life, without innovation. That some few other persons of quality and gentry had done in the same, but were looked upon with an eye of contempt and ill will, as enemies to art, ignorant and ill commonwealth's men, preferring their own ease and sloth before the general improvement of their country. His lordship added that he would not, by any further particulars, prevent the pleasure I should certainly take in viewing the grand academy, whether he was resolved I should go. He only desired me to observe a ruined building upon the side of a mountain about 3 miles distance, of which he gave me this account: that he had a very convenient mill within half a mile of his house, turned by a current from a large river, and sufficient for his own family as well as a great number of his tenants. That about 7 years ago a club of those projectors came to him with proposals to destroy the mill, and build another on the side of that mountain, on the long ridge whereof a long canal might be cut for the repository of water, but to be conveyed up by pipes and engines to supply the mill, because the wind and air upon the height agitated the water, and thereby made it fitter for the motion, and because the water descending down a declivity would turn the mill with half the current of a river, whose course is more upon a level. He said that being then not very well with the court, and pressed by many of his friends, he complied with the proposal, and after employing 100 men for 2 years, the work miscarried. The projectors went off, laying the blame entirely upon him, railing at him ever since, and putting others upon the same experiment, with equal assurance of success, as well as equal disappointment. In a few days we came back to town, and His Excellency, considering the bad character he had in the academy, would not go with me himself, but recommended me to a friend of his to bear me company thither. My lord was pleased to represent me as a great admirer of projects, and a person of much curiosity and easy belief, which indeed was not without truth, for I had myself been a sort of projector in my younger days. Chapter 5. This academy is not an entire single building, but a continuation of several houses on both sides of a street, which, growing waste and purchased and applied to that use, I was received very kindly by the warden, and went for many days to the academy. Every room hath in it one or more projectors, and I believe I could not be in fewer than 500 rooms. The first man I saw was of meagre aspect, with sooty hands and face, his hair and beard long, ragged, and singed in several places. His clothes, shirt, and skin were all of the same color. He had been 8 years on a project for extracting sunbeams out of cucumbers, which were to be put into vials hermetically sealed and let out to warm the air in raw inclement summers. He told me he did not doubt in 8 years more he should be able to supply the governor's gardens with sunshine at a reasonable rate, but he complained that his stock was low, and entreated me to give him something as an encouragement to ingenuity, especially since this had been a very dear season for cucumbers. I made him a small present, for my lord had furnished me with money on purpose, because he knew their practice of begging from all who go to see them. I went into another chamber, but was ready to hasten back, being almost overcome with a horrible stink. My conductor pressed me forward, conjuring me in a whisper to give no offense, which would be highly resented, and therefore I durst not so much as stop my nose. The projector of this cell was the most ancient student of the academy. His face and beard were a pale yellow, his hands and clothes daubed over with filth. When I was presented to him, he gave me a close embrace, a compliment I could well have excused. His employment, from his first coming into the academy, was an operation to reduce human excrement to its original food, by separating the several parts, removing the tincture which it receives from the gall, making the odor exhale, and scumming off the saliva. He had a weekly allowance from a society of a vessel filled with human odorants, about the bigness of a Bristol barrel. I saw another at work to calcine ice into gunpowder, who likewise showed me a treatise he had written concerning the malleability of fire, which he intended to publish. There was a most ingenious architect who had contrived a new method for building houses, by beginning at the roof and working downwards to the foundation, which he justified to me by the like practice of those two prudent insects, the bee and the spider. There was a man born blind who had several apprentices in his own condition. Their employment was to mix colors for painters, which their master taught them to distinguish by feeling and smelling. It was indeed my misfortune to find them at the time not perfect in their lessons. The professor himself happened to be generally mistaken. This artist is much encouraged and esteemed by the whole fraternity. In another apartment, I was highly pleased with a projector who had found a device of plowing the grounds with hogs to save the charges of plows, cattle, and labor. The method is this. In an acre of ground you bury, at 6 inches distance and 8 deep, a quantity of acorns, dates, chestnuts, and many other vegetables, where these animals are fondest. Then you drive 600 or more of them into the field, where in a few days they will root up the whole ground in search of their food, and make it fit for sowing, at the same time manuring it with their dung. It is true, upon experiment, they found the charge and trouble very great, and they had little or no crop. However, it is not doubted that this invention may be capable of great improvement. I went into another room, where the walls and ceilings were all hung round with cobwebs, except a narrow passage for the artist to go in and out. At my entrance, he called aloud to me not to disturb his webs. He lamented the fatal mistake the world had been so long in of using silkworms, while we had such plenty of domestic insects, who infinitely excelled the former, because they understood how to weave as well as spin. And he proposed further that in employing spiders the charge of dyeing silks would be wholly saved, whereof I was fully convinced when he showed me a vast number of flies most beautifully colored, wherewith he fed his spiders, assuring us that the webs would take a tincture from them, as he had them of all hues. He hoped to fit everybody's fancy, as soon as he could find proper food for the flies, of certain gums, oils, and other glutinous matter, to give a strength and consistence to the threads. There was an astronomer who had undertaken to place a sundial upon the great weathercock on the town-house by adjusting the annual and diurnal motions of the earth and sun, so as to answer and coincide with all accidental turnings by the wind. I visited many other apartments, but shall not trouble my reader with all the curiosities I observed, being studious of brevity. I had hitherto seen only one side of the academy, the other being appropriated to the advancers of speculative learning, of whom I shall say something when I have mentioned one illustrious person more, who is called among them the universal artist. He told us he had been 30 years employing his thoughts for the improvement of human life. He had 2 large rooms full of wonderful curiosities, and 50 men at work. Some were condensing air into a dry, tangible substance by extracting the nitre and letting the aqueons or fluid particles perlocate, others softening marble for pillows and pincushions, others petrifying the hooves of a living horse to preserve them from foundering. The artist himself was at that time busy upon two great designs. The first, to sow land with chaff, wherein he affirmed the true seminal virtue to be contained, as he demonstrated by several experiments which I was not skillful enough to comprehend. The other was, by a certain composition of gums, minerals, and vegetables, outwardly applied, to prevent the growth of wool upon two young lambs, and he hoped in a reasonable time to propagate the breed of naked sheep all over the kingdom. We crossed a walk to the other part of the academy, where, as I have already said, the projectors in speculative learning resided. The first professor I saw was in a very large room, with 40 pupils about him. After salutation, observing me to look earnestly upon a frame, which took up the greatest part of both the length and breadth of the room, he said perhaps I might wonder to see him employed in a project for improving speculative knowledge by practical and mechanical operations. But the world would soon be sensible of its usefulness, and he flattered himself that a more noble exalted thought never sprang in any other man's head. Everyone knew how laborious the usual method is of attending to arts and sciences, whereas by his contrivance the most ignorant person at a reasonable charge, and with a little bodily labor, may write books in philosophy, poetry, politics, law, mathematics, and theology, without the least assistance from genius or study. He then led me to a frame, about the sides whereof all his pupils stood in ranks. It was 20 foot square, placed in the middle of the room. The superficies were composed of several bits of wood, about the bigness of a die, but some larger than others. They were all linked together by slender wires. These bits of wood were covered on every square with paper pasted on them, and on these papers were written all the words in their language, in their several moods, tenses, and declensions, but without any order. The professor then desired me to observe, for he was going to set his engine at work. The pupils, at his command, took each of them hold of an iron handle, whereof there were 40 fixed round the edges of the frame, and giving them a sudden turn, the whole disposition of the words was entirely changed. He then commanded 36 of the lads to read the several lines softly, as they appeared upon the frame, and where they found 3 or 4 words together that might make part of a sentence, they dictated to the 4 remaining boys, who were scribes. This work was repeated 3 or 4 times, and at every turn the engine was so contrived that the words shifted into new places, as the square bits of wood moved upside down. 6 hours a day the young students were employed in this labor, and the professor showed me several volumes and a large folio already collected, of broken sentences which he intended to piece together, and out of those rich materials to give to the world a complete body of all arts and sciences, which, however, might still be improved, and much expedited, if the public would raise a fund for making and employing 500 such frames in legato, and oblige the managers to contribute in common for their several collections. He assured me that this invention he had employed all his thoughts from his youth, that he had emptied the whole vocabulary into his frame, and made the strictest computation of the general proportion there is in books between the numbers of particles, nouns, and verbs, and other parts of speech. I made my humblest acknowledgment, and promised if ever I had the good fortune to return to my native country, that I would do him justice, as the sole inventor of this wonderful machine, the form and contrivance of which I desired leave to delineate upon paper. I told him, although it were the custom of our learned in Europe to steal inventions from each other, who had thereby at least this advantage, that it became a controversy, which was the right owner, yet I would take such caution that he should have the honor entire without rival. We next went to the School of Languages, where 3 professors sat in consultation upon improving that of their country. The first project was to shorten discourse by cutting polysyllables into one another, leaving out verbs and participles, because in reality all things imaginable are but nouns. The other project was a scheme for entirely abolishing all words whatsoever, and this was urged as a great advantage in point of health as well as brevity. For it is plain that every word we speak is in some degree a diminution of our lungs by corrosion, and consequently contributes to the shortening of our lives. An expedient was therefore offered, that since words are only names for things, it would be more convenient for all men to carry about them such things as were necessary to express the particular business that they are to discourse in. And this invention would certainly have taken place to the great ease as well as health of the subject, if the women, in conjunction with the vulgar and illiterate, had not threatened to raise a rebellion, unless they might be allowed the liberty to speak with their tongues, after the manner of their ancestors. Such constant, irreconcilable enemies to science are the common people. However, many of the most learned and wise adhere to the new scheme of expressing themselves by things, which hath only this inconvenience attending to it, that if a man's business be very great and of various kinds, he must be obliged in proportion to carry a greater bundle of things upon his back, unless he can afford one or two strong servants to attend him. I have often beheld two of these sages almost sinking under the weight of their packs, like peddlers among us, who, when they meet in the streets, would lay down their loads, open their sacks, and hold conversation for an hour together, then put up their implements, help each other to resume their burthens, and take their leave. But for short conversations a man may carry implements in his pockets and under his arms, enough to supply him, and in his house he cannot be at loss. Therefore the room where company meet, who practice this art, is full of all things ready at hand, requisite to furnish matter for this kind of artificial converse. Another great advantage proposed by this invention was that it would serve in a universal language to be understood in all civilized nations, whose goods and utensils are generally of the same kind, or nearly resembling, so that their uses might be easily comprehended, and thus ambassadors would be qualified to treat with foreign princes and ministers of state, to whose tongues they were utter strangers. I was at the mathematical school, where the master taught his pupils after a method scarce imaginable to us in Europe. The proposition and demonstration were fairly written on a thin wafer, when ink comprised of a cephalic tincture. This the student was to swallow upon a fasting stomach, and for 3 days following eat nothing but bread and water. As the water digested, the tincture mounted to his brain, bearing the proposition along with it. But the success hath not hitherto been answerable, partially by some error in the quantum or composition, and partly by the perverseness of lads, to whom the bolus is so nauseous, that they generally steal aside and discharge it upwards before it can operate. Neither have they been yet persuaded to use so long an absence as the prescription requires,